Earl slowly straightened from where he'd been bending to retrieve the scattered items, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried a quality that David recognized from his own military experience, the kind of calm that preceded decisive action. "Young man," Earl said, looking directly at Rex, "I think you should pick up those items and apologize for your clumsiness." The suggestion was phrased politely, but something in Earl's tone made Rex take an involuntary step backward. David noticed that Earl's posture had changed subtly, his weight balanced in a way that suggested readiness for whatever might come next. Brad, however, interpreted Earl's response as weakness rather than restraint. "Did you just give one of my employees an order? You think being here a few years makes you some kind of authority figure? Let me explain something to you, Grandpa." What happened next occurred too quickly for most observers to process clearly, but David's military training allowed him to follow the sequence of events that would change everything about the dynamics. At MegaMart, Earl was about to reveal capabilities that none of them had suspected, and the confrontation that had been building for months was finally about to reach its inevitable conclusion. Brad reached for Earl's shoulder, intending to physically emphasize his point about respect and authority, but his hand never made contact. Earl moved with a fluidity that seemed to bend time itself, pivoting slightly to the left while simultaneously catching Brad's wrist in a grip that stopped the larger man's motion completely. The movement was so smooth and economical that several witnesses later disagreed about whether it had actually happened. "Son," Earl said quietly, his voice carrying a steel that none of them had ever heard before, "I'd strongly advise you to reconsider your next move." Brad's face contorted with shock and rage as he realized his wrist was completely immobilized in Earl's seemingly gentle grip. He tried to pull away and discovered that the older man's fingers were locked around his bones like a steel vise, applying just enough pressure to make movement impossible without causing actual damage. "Let go of me right now," Brad snarled, his voice rising to a pitch that echoed across the store. "You just assaulted a supervisor. You're finished here, old man. I'm calling security and having you arrested." Earl's expression remained perfectly calm as he maintained his grip on Brad's wrist. "Security cameras will show that you initiated physical contact by reaching for me without permission. I'm simply restraining you until you demonstrate that you can control yourself. Would you like me to release you, or do you need a moment to think about your behavior?" Tommy and Rex exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure how to respond to this development. Their entire relationship with Brad was predicated on his dominance and their roles as enforcers of his authority. Seeing him physically controlled by someone they'd dismissed as harmless challenged every assumption about the workplace hierarchy they'd helped create. "This is insane," Tommy said, taking a step toward Earl. "You can't just grab people. Let him go, or we'll make you let him go." Earl's gaze shifted to Tommy without releasing Brad's wrist, and something in the older man's eyes made Tommy freeze. "Mid-step, I wouldn't recommend that course of action. Your supervisor is learning an important lesson about respecting his coworkers. I suggest you learn the same lesson without requiring a more direct demonstration." Rex, demonstrating more intelligence than his companions, raised his hands and backed away from the confrontation. "Hey, I don't want any part of this. This is getting crazy." Brad's struggles against Earl's grip were becoming more desperate, but every attempt to break free only emphasized how completely outmatched he was, despite his size advantage. Sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead as the reality of his situation sank in. "You think you're tough because you can grab someone's wrist?" Brad gasped, his voice strained from the effort of trying to escape. "You're nothing but a washed-up old man who pushes boxes around a warehouse. When I get loose, you're going to learn what real strength looks like." Earl released Brad's wrist so suddenly that the younger man stumbled backward, nearly losing his balance. Instead of pressing his advantage, Earl stepped back and assumed a relaxed stance that somehow managed to suggest both readiness and complete confidence. You want to see real strength? Earl asked mildly. That can be arranged. The electronics section included a display of large-screen televisions, each unit weighing approximately 60 pounds and mounted on wheeled platforms for easy movement. Earl walked over to one of these displays, grasped it with both hands, and lifted the entire assembly television, platform, and mounting hardware completely off the ground. The combined weight of nearly 100 pounds came up as easily as if Earl were picking up a briefcase. But Earl wasn't finished with his demonstration. Setting the television assembly aside, he walked to a pallet of bagged water softener salt that had been positioned near the customer service area for weekend distribution. Each bag weighed 40 pounds, and the pallet contained 24 bags arranged in neat stacks. Without apparent effort, Earl lifted the entire pallet, raising nearly 1,000 pounds of dead weight to chest level and holding it steady for several seconds before setting it down again. The wooden pallet creaked under the strain, but Earl's breathing remained completely normal throughout the lift. The witnesses to this display of strength stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they just observed. David, despite his own hidden capabilities, felt his jaw drop at the casual demonstration of power from someone he'd assumed was just another aging warehouse worker. Janet had emerged from her customer service booth and was staring openly, her paperwork forgotten. Even the security guard had appeared and was watching with obvious amazement. 40 years of serious lifting, Earl explained conversationally, brushing his hands off on his work pants. I started in the Army when I was 18, never stopped. Funny how people make assumptions based on appearances. Brad's face had gone pale as the implications of Earl's strength demonstration sank in. The man he'd been harassing and dismissing as harmless had just casually lifted weights that would challenge competitive strongmen. More importantly, Earl had made his point without showing off or becoming aggressive, a display of control that was somehow more intimidating than raw power alone. Now then, Earl continued, his voice returning to its normal quiet tone, let's talk about respect and workplace behavior. Master Sergeant Earl Washington, United States Army, retired after 22 years of active duty. Logistics and supply specialist, combat veteran of 3 deployments, and holder of more commendations than you could probably pronounce correctly. Earl's revelation of his military background hit the assembled group like a second shockwave. David felt a surge of recognition and respect for a fellow veteran, who had clearly achieved the senior NCO rank that David himself had been working toward before his career was cut short. During my military service, Earl continued, I was responsible for managing supply chains that kept entire divisions operational in hostile territory. I supervised hundreds of soldiers, managed millions of dollars in equipment, and made decisions that directly affected mission success and personnel safety. After retirement, I worked in civilian logistics for 15 years before taking this position for reasons that are none of your business. Earl's steady gaze moved from Brad to Tommy to Rex, ensuring that each of them understood they were being addressed directly. What I observe here is a textbook example of toxic leadership, abuse of authority, harassment of subordinates, and the creation of a hostile work environment that undermines productivity and morale. Brad found his voice, though it lacked its usual confidence. You can't just, this isn't the military. You don't have any authority here. Authority comes from competence and character, not from job titles, Earl replied calmly. And right now, I'm the only person in this group who's demonstrating either quality. Earl turned to address David directly, his voice carrying the kind of respect that one veteran showed another. Specialist Castellanos, you've been conducting yourself with remarkable restraint under circumstances that would have broken lesser men. Your service record and current behavior both reflect credit on your military training. Earl's domain was a maze of pallets, conveyor belts, and industrial shelving that stretched 30 feet to the ceiling. He worked alone most nights, using a combination of manual labor and mechanical equipment, to break down truck deliveries and sort merchandise for the floor staff to collect. It was physically demanding work that required both strength and intelligence. But because it happened behind the scenes, Earl might as well have been invisible to the supervisors who ran the store's front operations. His appearance certainly didn't command attention or respect. Earl stood just under 6 feet tall, with the kind of wiry build that suggested endurance rather than power. His dark skin showed the lines and scars of decades of physical work, and his graying hair was always covered by the same faded baseball cap that had seen better years. The receiving department's uniform was even less flattering than the floor staff's vest's thick work pants, steel-toed boots, and long-sleeved shirts that hid the definition in his arms and shoulders, to anyone who bothered to notice him at all. Earl looked exactly like what they expected from a 62-year-old warehouse worker, tired, worn down, probably counting the days until retirement. The reality was far more complex, but Earl had learned long ago that letting people underestimate him was often the smartest strategy in corporate environments, where youth and aggression were valued over experience and wisdom. Earl's path to MegaMart had been neither straight nor predictable. After 22 years in the Army, retiring as a master sergeant in logistics and supply, he'd spent another 15 years working for various shipping and transportation companies. His military pension and savings should have been enough for a comfortable retirement, but his ex-wife's medical bills and his daughter's college expenses had required him to keep working well past the age when most men his size and occupation would have stepped back. The job at MegaMart had been intended as a temporary solution, something to bridge the gap until his financial obligations were met. But Earl had discovered something unexpected in the routine and solitude of the receiving dock: peace. After decades of managing complex supply chains, training soldiers, and dealing with military bureaucracy, there was something deeply satisfying about work that had clear parameters and measurable results. Each night, trucks would arrive with precisely documented cargo. Earl would process that cargo according to established procedures, verify that everything matched the paperwork, and organize it for efficient distribution. Problems were concrete and solvable. Success was measurable. Unlike the political complexities of military leadership or corporate middle management, the receiving dock rewarded competence and consistency above all else. The warehouse's isolation also meant Earl could maintain workout routines that would have been impossible in more visible positions. During his mandatory break periods and lunch hour, he'd use the loading dock space and equipment for training that most people would find impossible to believe. Empty shipping containers became platforms for box jumps that would challenge athletes half his age. Loaded pallets became weights for farmers' walks and overhead presses. The dock's concrete floor provided perfect space for body weight exercises that had kept him functional and strong. Through 6 decades of hard living, Earl's approach to fitness was old-school military: functional movements, compound exercises, and mental toughness over aesthetic goals. He'd been lifting heavy things and moving them around since he was 18 years old, first in Army training and then through decades of logistics work. Unlike the gym culture that focused on isolation exercises and mirror muscles, Earl's training was designed around real-world applications and job-specific strength. His best deadlift of 410 pounds at age 62 would have been impressive for someone half his age. His ability to overhead press 185 pounds demonstrated the kind of functional strength that came from decades of consistent training and manual labor. But these numbers existed in a vacuum, unknown to his coworkers and completely irrelevant to his official job responsibilities. The separation between Earl's public persona and his private capabilities was deliberate and carefully maintained. Corporate America had little patience for older workers who seemed too capable or ambitious. Managers preferred employees who stayed in their lanes, didn't ask difficult questions, and could be relied upon to accept whatever assignments they were given without complaint. Earl had learned to project exactly the image that would allow him to do his job in peace, while avoiding the kind of attention that might complicate his work life. But that same isolation that protected Earl also gave him a unique perspective on the dynamics playing out in other parts of the store. The receiving dock's location meant he saw everything: which employees arrived early and stayed late, who was struggling with personal problems, and most importantly, who was being targeted by the power games that seemed to infect every workplace. Earl's military experience had taught him to read people and situations with the kind of accuracy that came from life and death consequences. In combat zones, misreading someone's intentions or capabilities could get people killed. Those same skills translated perfectly to civilian environments, where the stakes were different, but the human dynamics remained surprisingly similar. He'd been watching the situation between Brad Hutchinson and David Castellanos develop for months, recognizing patterns that reminded him of some of the worst NCOs he'd served under during his military career. Brad's behavior had all the hallmarks of a small-time tyrant, someone who'd been given just enough authority to be dangerous, but not enough responsibility to be held accountable for the consequences of his actions. Earl had seen David's type before as well: competent soldiers who'd been broken by circumstances beyond their control, then forced to rebuild their lives in environments that didn't value their experience or capabilities. The military produced thousands of these men and women every year, people with valuable skills and strong work ethics who struggled to find their place in civilian hierarchies that operated by completely different rules. The tragedy Earl observed was that both men were wasting their potential in different ways. Brad was using his position to feed an ego that would never be satisfied by retail management, while David was hiding capabilities that could serve him well if he could find the confidence to deploy them appropriately. Neither man understood his own situation clearly enough to make the changes that would improve his circumstances. Earl's position in the warehouse meant he intersected with both men regularly but predictably. David would come to the receiving dock several times each shift to collect merchandise for his assigned aisles, always polite and efficient, but clearly carrying the weight of stress that came from constant harassment. Brad would occasionally visit the dock during his rounds, usually to look for problems he could escalate into performance issues for the employees under his supervision. These interactions gave Earl opportunities to observe both men in different contexts and moods. He'd noticed how David's posture and demeanor would change depending on whether Brad was around, and how Brad's behavior would shift when he thought he was dealing with someone who couldn't fight back. Earl had also noticed details that others missed. The way David moved suggested physical training and discipline, while Brad's bluster often covered uncertainty about his own capabilities. More concerning to Earl was the escalation he'd been observing over recent weeks. Brad's harassment of David was becoming more frequent and more personal, crossing lines from professional criticism into territory that felt dangerously close to workplace bullying. Earl recognized the pattern from military environments where unchecked authority had been allowed to become abusive, and he understood that situations like this rarely resolved themselves peacefully. The first incident happened on a Wednesday night in early October, when David was restocking the automotive section near the back of the store. He'd been methodically arranging motor oil bottles when Brad appeared with Tommy and Rex in tow, their footsteps echoing in the quiet aisle like a pack of predators circling wounded prey. Well, Brad announced, his voice carrying the false joviality that David had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "Look at our little soldier boy, playing with his toy cars and motor oil. Tell me, Castellanos, did they teach you about automotive maintenance in the Army, or were you too busy hiding in the back while real men did the fighting?" David's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he continued his work without looking up. "Just doing my job, Brad." "That's coach to you," Brad corrected, stepping closer until David could smell the coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "And I asked you a question. What exactly did you do over there in Afghanistan?" Were you one of those desk jockeys who never left the base? Or did you actually see some action? Rex, who had chosen cooperation over confrontation during the original confrontation, was proven to be genuinely reformed in his approach to coworker relationships. His harassment training had apparently been taken seriously, and he was making visible efforts to treat everyone with basic respect and professionalism. I never really thought about how the stuff we were doing affected people, Rex admitted to David during an awkward but sincere apology conversation. I mean, I knew it wasn't nice, but I didn't understand how it felt from your side. The training videos made it pretty clear that we were being jerks. The written apologies that Earl had required were proving to be more than just symbolic gestures. The process of articulating their behavior in writing had forced all three former harassers to confront the reality of what they'd been doing and acknowledge the impact on their victims. More importantly, the apologies were being accompanied by observable changes in behavior that suggested genuine understanding rather than mere compliance. David's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all the changes occurring at MegaMart. The quiet, defensive employee who had spent months hiding his capabilities was being replaced by someone who moved with confidence, spoke with authority when appropriate, and commanded respect through competence rather than demanding it through position. The man who had once been called Scrawny by people who had never seen him lift 300 pounds was finally ready to show the world exactly what he was capable of achieving. 3 months after Earl's intervention, David received the phone call that would change everything. Dr. Patricia Reeves, his physical therapist, was on the line with an opportunity that seemed almost too good to be real. David, I know this might sound unusual, but I've been asked to recommend someone for a position with Titan Construction. They're looking for a project coordinator with military engineering background and proven ability to work under pressure. The job involves logistics coordination for large-scale infrastructure projects, and they specifically want someone with combat deployment experience. David listened carefully as Dr. Reeves explained that her reputation in the rehabilitation community had led to connections with employers who valued the unique skill sets that injured veterans often possessed. Titan Construction had learned that former military engineers often brought problem-solving abilities and stress tolerance that civilian candidates couldn't match, even when physical limitations required accommodation. The salary is $68,000 annually, full benefits, and they're specifically interested in veterans who've demonstrated resilience in overcoming service-related challenges. I told them about your progress in physical therapy and your current employment situation. They want to interview you next week. After ending the call, David sat in his apartment staring at the framed photograph of his old squad, feeling something he hadn't experienced in over 2 years, genuine excitement about his professional future. The position Dr. Reeves had described sounded like exactly the kind of work he'd been trained for, the kind of meaningful employment that would utilize his capabilities rather than hide them. But first, he had to finish his final week at MegaMart. Carlos Ruiz had been understanding about David's notice, expressing genuine regret about losing such a reliable employee, while congratulating him on finding work that matched his qualifications. The transition would be smooth. David had trained his replacement thoroughly and documented all his procedures with the same attention to detail that had characterized his military service. The opportunity to demonstrate his true capabilities came sooner than expected. On Thursday night, MegaMart received an emergency delivery of exercise equipment for a promotional display that had to be assembled before the weekend sale began. The shipment included commercial-grade weight machines, each piece weighing between 200 and 400 pounds and requiring precise positioning within the store's layout. The day shift had attempted to move the equipment using standard dollies and multiple employees, but the weight and awkward dimensions had proven challenging. Several pieces remained in the loading dock area, creating obstacles for normal operations and threatening to delay the promotional setup that corporate had mandated for Friday morning. Carlos approached David during his evening break with a request that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. I know you're leaving next week, but I have a situation that requires someone with your particular background. Think you could take a look at this equipment problem and see if your engineering experience suggests any solutions? David followed Carlos to the loading dock, where Earl was examining the stranded exercise equipment with the analytical expression of someone calculating logistics problems. The two veterans had developed a strong working relationship over the past months, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of military problem-solving approaches. These pieces need to move individually, Earl explained, gesturing at a cable crossover machine that resembled a small aircraft in its complexity and weight distribution. Standard equipment can't handle the load safely, and we don't have enough people scheduled tonight to manage team lifting without risking injuries. David studied the equipment specifications and store layout, his mind automatically calculating weight distributions, pivot points, and movement strategies. The problem was essentially identical to challenges he'd faced in Afghanistan when moving heavy construction equipment through confined spaces with limited personnel and resources. I have an idea, David said, but it's going to require some unconventional thinking. What David proposed was a systematic approach that treated each piece of equipment as an individual engineering challenge rather than a simple moving task. Using leverage principles and careful positioning, single individuals could manipulate weights that would normally require teams of people working together. The solution required David to demonstrate capabilities that none of his MegaMart colleagues had ever witnessed. The cable crossover machine, weighing 380 pounds according to its specifications, became the test case for his approach. David positioned himself at the machine's balance point, secured his grip using techniques perfected through months of deadlifting, and executed a lift that brought the entire assembly off the ground with smooth, controlled movement. The weight that had challenged multiple employees working together came up as steadily as if David were handling routine warehouse merchandise. The small crowd of employees who had gathered to watch the equipment moving project fell silent as David carried the machine across the loading dock and positioned it precisely where the store layout required. His breathing remained controlled throughout the lift, and his movement was so fluid that the enormous weight seemed almost manageable. 380 pounds, Earl announced to the assembled group, reading the specifications directly from the equipment manual. Specialist Castellanos just single-handedly moved equipment that we thought would require a forklift. Janet, Mike, Rex, and several other employees who had witnessed months of David's harassment stared in amazement as the quiet, scrawny veteran systematically moved piece after piece of commercial exercise equipment with the kind of casual competence that redefined their understanding of what was possible. Tommy, who was completing his final week of warehouse remediation under Earl's supervision, watched with undisguised awe as David lifted and positioned weights that Tommy couldn't have budged even with assistance. The physical capabilities that had been hidden beneath David's unassuming appearance were finally being revealed in a context where they could be appreciated rather than mocked. "How long have you been able to do that?" Carlos asked after David had completed moving the entire shipment with minimal assistance. David straightened from positioning the final piece of equipment, his uniform showing no signs of the exertion that should have accompanied such demanding physical work. Military training emphasized functional strength over appearance. "I've been working with a physical therapist who happens to specialize in powerlifting. Turns out rehabilitation and strength training have a lot in common." Earl stepped forward with the kind of formal recognition that one veteran gave another after witnessing exceptional performance under challenging conditions. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you just observed was a textbook demonstration of why the United States Army trains combat engineers to think creatively and execute precisely under pressure. Specialist Castellanos just solved a logistics problem. That was going to cost this company time, money, and operational efficiency. The question hit David like a physical blow, bringing back memories he spent most of his waking hours trying to suppress. Images of bridges built under enemy fire, of roads cleared while snipers took shots from distant hills, of the day that steel beam had shifted and changed his life forever. But he knew better than to take the bait. "I did my job," David repeated quietly, focused intently on aligning the oil bottles with mechanical precision. Tommy laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the metal shelving. I bet he was one of those pogs person other than Grunt. Probably. Spent the whole deployment fixing air conditioners for officers while real soldiers were getting shot at. Rex nodded eagerly, always ready to amplify whatever direction the conversation was taking. "My cousin was over there with the Marines. Said half the Army guys never even left the wire. Just sat around playing video games and collecting combat pay for doing nothing." David's hands stilled for just a moment, his military training warring with his civilian need to keep this job. He'd been outside the wire plenty of times, had earned his combat engineer badge the hard way, had built infrastructure that saved lives and cleared obstacles under conditions that would have sent these three running home to their mothers. But explaining that would require discussing details he'd never shared with anyone, memories that still woke him up some nights covered in cold sweat. "Must be nice," Brad continued, warming to his theme, "getting all that free college money and disability payments for what was probably just a workplace accident. Meanwhile, those of us who stayed home and worked honest jobs for honest pay don't get any special treatment." The comment about his disability hit David harder than Brad could have known. The nerve damage in his back wasn't just about physical pain, it was a constant reminder of capabilities he'd lost, of the moment when his carefully planned career had ended in a shower of twisted steel and concrete dust. But arguing would only make things worse, and David had learned that lesson the hard way in previous jobs. "If you gentlemen don't need anything from this aisle," David said carefully, "I should get back to work. These shelves won't stock themselves." Brad's eyes narrowed at the dismissal, even though it had been phrased as respectfully as possible. "Actually, we do need something. The corporate wants this whole section reorganized by morning, all the motor oil sorted by viscosity, not brand. Guess you'll be here a while longer than usual tonight." David glanced at the section he'd already spent. 2 hours organizing, exactly according to the planogram that had been updated just last week. Starting over would mean at least 3 additional hours of work, putting him well into overtime that he knew Brad would find a way to criticize later. But refusing wasn't an option. "Of course," David said simply. "I'll get right on it." The following week brought a new escalation. David arrived for his shift to find that his locker had been randomly selected for a surprise inspection. According to the note Brad had left inside his personal belongings, every item had been removed and searched, including his prescription pain medication, which was now sitting openly on the break room table for anyone to see and comment on. "Hope you don't mind," Brad said when David approached to collect his things. "We've been having some problems with employee theft lately, and management wants us to stay on top of security issues. Found these pills in your bag pretty strong stuff. You sure you should be operating equipment while you're on these?" David carefully collected his medication, acutely aware that Tommy and Rex were watching from across the break room, probably memorizing details they could use for future harassment. The pills were legitimately prescribed for his service-related injuries, and he took them exactly as directed. But he knew that explaining the medical necessity would only provide more ammunition for future attacks. "They're prescribed," David sighed quietly. "I take them as needed for chronic pain related to my service injury." Right, Brad nodded with exaggerated understanding. "Well, just make sure that chronic pain doesn't interfere with your job performance. We can't have impaired employees putting customers at risk." The implication was clear and completely unfair. David had never shown any signs of impairment at work, had never missed a day due to medication side effects, and had never let his physical limitations interfere with his responsibilities. But Brad had succeeded in creating doubt and suspicion where none had existed before, planting seeds that would make every future interaction more difficult. By November, the harassment had evolved into more sophisticated psychological warfare. David would arrive for his shift to find his assigned aisles in deliberate disarray, with merchandise scattered across the floor and price tags removed or switched. When he'd report the problems, Brad would express surprise and disappointment that David hadn't noticed these issues during his previous shift. Despite the fact that David always left his sections perfectly organized, work orders would appear, with David's name on them for tasks in distant parts of the store, forcing him to spend hours walking back and forth instead of working efficiently. These orders would later disappear from the system, leaving no record of who had created them or why, but always resulting in legitimate assignments falling behind schedule. The most insidious attacks were the ones that targeted David's military background directly. Brad had somehow learned details about David's service record and would work them into conversations in ways designed to maximize humiliation. References to fake heroes and wounded warriors who milked the system became regular features of staff meetings where David was present, but couldn't respond without seeming defensive or confrontational. David's sleeping patterns, already disrupted by working nights and dealing with chronic pain, became increasingly erratic as the stress mounted. He'd lie awake during the day replaying conversations and imagining different responses, better comebacks, scenarios where he'd finally stood up for himself instead of taking whatever abuse Brad decided to dish out. But every time he considered confronting the situation directly, practical concerns would reassert themselves. He needed this job. His disability payments covered rent and basic expenses, but without the MegaMart income, he couldn't afford his medications, his physical therapy, or the simple dignity of financial independence. Job hunting while already employed was difficult enough for veterans. Job hunting after being fired for insubordination would be nearly impossible. The psychological toll was becoming harder to hide. Earl noticed that David's shoulders stayed hunched even when Brad wasn't around, and that his responses to simple questions had become increasingly monosyllabic. Janet from customer service mentioned to Mike, the maintenance guy, that David looked like he wasn't sleeping well, and Mike had observed that David's hands shook slightly when he thought nobody was watching. Most troubling to David was the way the constant stress was affecting his physical therapy and strength training. His lifts were suffering as tension and anxiety disrupted his focus and recovery. The gym had been his sanctuary, the place where he could remember who he used to be and work toward who he might become again. But now even those stolen hours at Iron Temple were contaminated by the knowledge that he'd have to return to MegaMart and face another night of psychological warfare. The breaking point was approaching, though none of the participants could see it clearly yet. David's military discipline was keeping him functional, but that same discipline was also building pressure that would eventually need release. Brad's confidence was growing with each successful humiliation, pushing him toward increasingly risky territory. And Earl was watching it all from the shadows, recognizing patterns that reminded him of situations that had ended badly in his own military experience. Something was going to give, and soon. David's alarm buzzed at 9:30 a.m., pulling him from the restless half-sleep that had become his normal state. 6 hours after clocking out from MegaMart, his body ached from the previous night's deliberate harassment, but his mind was already calculating the hours until he'd have to return and face it all again. The prescription bottle on his nightstand rattled as he reached for it, containing enough pain medication to make the physical discomfort manageable, but nothing that could touch the deeper wounds to his pride and self-respect. The use of David's former rank, spoken with the authority of a senior NCO who clearly outranked him, caused David to unconsciously straighten his posture in a way that reminded everyone present of his own military background. However, Earl continued, there comes a time when tactical patience must give way to strategic action. That time has arrived. Earl's attention returned to Brad, who was still processing the complete reversal of his assumed dominance. Young man, you have approximately 30 seconds to decide whether you want to resolve this situation professionally or face the consequences of your behavior through official channels. I have documentation of your harassment patterns, witness testimony from multiple employees, and video evidence of tonight's conduct. The mention of documentation and evidence clearly caught Brad off guard. He'd assumed his harassment had been conducted without witnesses or consequences, not realizing that Earl had been systematically gathering information while appearing to mind his own business. Choose carefully, Earl advised, because the next few minutes will determine whether you leave here with your job and dignity intact, or whether you leave here as an example to others about what happens when workplace harassment goes too far. Brad's mouth opened and closed several times before any words emerged, his usual bravado completely shattered by the dual revelations of Earl's physical capabilities and military authority. The confident supervisor who had spent months terrorizing David and other employees was gone, replaced by someone who clearly understood that he was facing consequences he'd never anticipated. We were just ... It was just workplace banter. Brad stammered, his voice lacking any conviction. Nobody was being harassed. We were just joking around with the guys. Earl's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the customer service area seemed to drop several degrees. Joking around. Is that what you call questioning a veteran's service record? Making comments about disability compensation? Creating hostile working conditions through systematic harassment? Earl pulled his phone from his pocket, and the small device suddenly seemed as threatening as any weapon. I've been documenting incidents for the past 6 weeks. Timestamps, witness observations, direct quotes. Would you like me to read some of your more creative comments about Specialist Castellanos back to you? Tommy, who had been silent since Earl's strength demonstration, finally found his voice. Look, we didn't mean anything serious. It was just giving him a hard time, like hazing or whatever. Hazing, Earl repeated flatly, his eyes focusing on Tommy with the kind of intensity that made grown soldiers reconsider their life choices. Son, do you understand what hazing actually involves? It's the systematic abuse of junior personnel by their superiors, typically in violation of military regulations and civilian law. Its conduct destroys unit cohesion, undermines leadership, effectiveness, and has resulted in courts-martial and criminal prosecutions. Earl's voice carried the authority of someone who had actually dealt with hazing cases during his military career, who understood the legal and professional ramifications in ways that these 3 retail workers never could. The casual way they dismissed their behavior as harmless fun was being systematically dismantled by someone who knew exactly what such conduct looked like when examined under official scrutiny. Moreover, Earl continued, what you've been doing isn't hazing, it's workplace harassment with clear discrimination against a protected class of employee. Veterans are covered under federal employment protection laws, and the behaviors I've observed and documented constitute clear violations that could result in corporate liability, personal legal consequences, and criminal charges. Rex, who had been trying to blend into the background since the confrontation began, raised his hands in surrender. I'm out of this. I never touched anybody. I never said anything really bad. This is between you and them. Earl's gaze shifted to Rex with the kind of calculated assessment that senior NCOs used when evaluating the reliability of soldiers under pressure. Bystander complicity is still complicity, son. When you witness harassment and do nothing to stop it, you become part of the problem. But you're right that your level of involvement is different from your associates here. The distinction Earl drew between Rex's passive participation and Brad and Tommy's active harassment demonstrated a strategic understanding of group dynamics that went far beyond anything they'd expected from the quiet warehouse worker. He was systematically isolating the primary perpetrators while offering conditional clemency to those whose cooperation might be valuable. "Here's what's going to happen," Earl announced, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had issued orders in far more serious circumstances. "Brad, you're going to walk over to that computer terminal and submit your resignation, effective immediately. You're going to cite personal reasons and thank the company for the opportunities you've been given." Brad's face flushed red with indignation. "Are you insane? I'm not resigning. You can't make me quit my job. I've been here 8 years. I have seniority, I have performance reviews, you have documented evidence of workplace harassment, abuse of supervisory authority, and creation of a hostile work environment." Earl cut him off. "You have video surveillance of tonight's conduct that shows you initiating physical contact with a subordinate employee. You have witness testimony from multiple co-workers who will confirm your pattern of inappropriate behavior." Earl's phone appeared in his hand again, and he began scrolling through what was apparently an extensive collection of documentation. November 15th, 10:47 p.m. Quote, "Maybe he's practicing for his future career. This is probably the best he'll ever do." November 8th, 11:23 p.m. Quote, "Look at our little soldier boy, playing with his toy cars and motor oil." The precise time, stamps and exact quotations made it clear that Earl's documentation was far more comprehensive than anyone had realized. Brad's face grew progressively paler as he understood the extent of the evidence that had been compiled against him. November 22nd, Earl continued relentlessly. 11:45 p.m. Quote, "What exactly did you do over there that was so important? What did you build that couldn't have been built by any construction worker with half a brain?" That particular comment, questioning a combat veteran's service record, falls under federal hate crime statutes in some jurisdictions. Tommy had been growing increasingly agitated as the scope of Earl's evidence became clear. "This is entrapment or something. You can't just record people without their permission. That's illegal." Earl's smile was thin and completely without warmth. "Actually, son, retail environments have no expectation of privacy. Every word you've spoken in this store has been in a public workplace with full surveillance coverage. My documentation simply supplements the company's existing security records." The mention of security records brought a new dimension of panic to Brad's face. He'd apparently forgotten that MegaMart's extensive camera system had been recording every interaction, every harassment incident, every moment of the systematic abuse he'd been inflicting on David and other employees. "But here's the interesting part," Earl continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a lecture to particularly slow students. "I don't actually need to pursue legal remedies or corporate complaints. I have a much simpler solution that benefits everyone involved." Earl turned to address the small crowd of employees who had gathered to witness the confrontation. Janet was still standing outside her customer service booth, her paperwork forgotten. Mike had appeared from somewhere in the store and was watching with obvious fascination. 2 security guards had positioned themselves at the edges of the group, clearly uncertain about their role in the proceedings. "What everyone here is witnessing," Earl announced to the assembled group, "is a teachable moment about respect, dignity, and the consequences of workplace harassment. These 3 gentlemen have been conducting themselves in ways that violate company policy, federal employment law, and basic human decency." Earl's audience was listening with the kind of attention usually reserved for emergency announcements or termination meetings. The casual authority in his voice, combined with the demonstration of capabilities they'd never suspected, had transformed him from background employee to the most influential person in the building. "However," Earl continued, I believe in redemption and second chances for people who demonstrate genuine remorse and commitment to change. So I'm going to offer our friends here an opportunity to resolve this situation without destroying their futures or creating unnecessary complications for the company. Brad seized on what sounded like a lifeline. What kind of opportunity? What do you want? Earl's expression suggested he'd been waiting for exactly that question. Brad, you're going to request a transfer to day shift, a different department, where your supervisory authority over night staff will be eliminated. You're going to complete mandatory harassment prevention training, and you're going to write formal apologies to every employee you've harassed. The term sounded reasonable compared to termination and legal consequences, but Brad's relief was premature. Tommy, you're going to complete the same training and write the same apologies. You're also going to spend your next 10 shifts working directly under my supervision in the warehouse, where you'll learn what real work looks like. Tommy opened his mouth to object, then apparently thought better of it. Rex, you get off easy because you showed intelligence by backing down when things escalated. You'll complete harassment training and stay away from your former associates during work hours. The systematic dismantling of their power structure was complete, but Earl wasn't finished with his demonstration of strategic authority. The silence that followed Earl's ultimatum stretched for nearly 30 seconds, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of the store's ventilation system. Brad's face cycled through several expressions: anger, disbelief, calculation, and finally a grudging recognition that his options had been systematically eliminated by someone he'd completely underestimated. "And if we don't accept your terms?" Brad asked, his voice carrying the hollow bravado of someone who already knew the answer. Earl's response was delivered with the patience of a teacher, explaining simple mathematics to struggling students. "Then I submit my documentation to corporate human resources, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the local district attorney's office. Your harassment of a disabled veteran becomes a federal case. Your assault on a subordinate employee becomes a criminal matter, and your 8 years of seniority become irrelevant because you'll be terminated for cause with no severance or unemployment benefits." Earl paused to let the implications sink in before continuing. "More importantly, your behavior becomes part of the public record. Future employers will find detailed accounts of your workplace harassment when they conduct background checks. Your reputation in this community becomes permanently damaged. Your family and friends learn exactly who you really are when you think nobody's watching." The mention of public exposure and family shame hit Brad harder than any of the professional consequences. His face went ashen as he imagined having to explain to his wife, his children, his parents, and his neighbors why he'd been fired for harassing a disabled veteran. Tommy, whose emotional intelligence had never been his strongest quality, made one final attempt at defiance. "This is insane. You can't just take over the store and start giving orders like you're some kind of general. We have rights. We have union representation." Earl's smile was genuinely amused for the first time since the confrontation began. "Son, retail workers in this state have no union representation, and your rights don't include the freedom to harass your coworkers without consequences. As for taking over the store, I'm not assuming any authority that wasn't already mine as a senior employee with legitimate concerns about workplace safety." Earl gestured toward the assembled crowd of employees who had gathered to witness the confrontation. "Janet, Mike, both security guards, and half a dozen other workers have now heard your supervisor admit to conducting what he called workplace banter, but what any reasonable person would recognize as systematic harassment. They've seen physical evidence of my documentation and witnessed your responses to being confronted about your behavior." The strategic brilliance of Earl's approach was becoming clear to everyone present. He hadn't just gathered evidence in private. He'd maneuvered Brad into a public confrontation where his behavior and attitude would be witnessed by the very people who would be asked to corroborate any official complaints. Every word Brad had said, every excuse he'd made, every display of arrogance and contempt had been observed by coworkers who could testify to his character and conduct. David, who had been silent throughout Earl's systematic dismantling of his modeling of his tormentors, finally found his voice. "Earl, you didn't have to do this. I could have handled the situation myself." Earl turned to David with an expression that combined respect with gentle correction. "Specialist, you were handling the situation exactly as your training taught you, with discipline, patience, and strategic thinking. But sometimes tactical situations require intervention from higher authority, and that's exactly what happened here." The use of military terminology wasn't accidental. Earl was establishing a command relationship that transcended corporate hierarchy and appealed to David's ingrained respect for senior NCO authority. By framing his intervention as military leadership rather than civilian workplace politics, Earl was making it easier for David to accept help without feeling diminished. "Besides," Earl continued, "this situation was never just about you. Workplace harassment creates a toxic environment that affects everyone. These three have been bullying other employees for months, and their behavior was escalating toward something that could have resulted in serious consequences for innocent people." Janet stepped forward from her customer service booth, her voice shaky but determined. "He's right, David. They've been making comments about my age, about Mike's accent, about anyone they thought couldn't fight back. Tonight was just the first time someone actually did fight back." Mike nodded vigorously in agreement. "Earl's been watching out for all of us, documenting everything, waiting for the right moment. He told me last week that he was building a case, but I didn't understand how serious it was." The revelation that Earl had been coordinating his efforts with other employees added another dimension to his strategic planning. He hadn't just been gathering evidence. He'd been building a coalition of witnesses and supporters who could corroborate his observations and testify to the broader pattern of harassment. Rex, who had been trying to remain invisible throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "I accept your terms. I'll do the training, I'll write the apologies, I'll stay away from these guys. I never wanted things to get this crazy anyway." Earl nodded approvingly. "Smart choice, Rex. You show that kind of judgment consistently, and you might actually have a future in retail management. The kind of management that leads by example rather than intimidation." Tommy looked around desperately for support that wasn't coming. The other employees were either openly supportive of Earl's intervention or carefully neutral, but none of them were willing to stand up for someone who had made their work lives more difficult through months of aggressive behavior. "Fine," Tommy said through gritted teeth. "I'll do your stupid training and work in your warehouse, but this isn't over. You can't watch everyone all the time." Earl's expression grew cold, and when he spoke his voice carried the kind of menace that made experienced soldiers reconsider their career choices. "Son, that sounds very much like a threat. And threatening witnesses to workplace harassment is a felony in this state. Would you like to rephrase that comment, or should I add it to my documentation?" Tommy's face went pale as he realized he'd just made his situation exponentially worse. "I didn't mean that. I wasn't threatening anyone. I just meant ... I don't know what I meant. You meant that you're angry about facing consequences for your behavior, and you wanted everyone to know that you don't accept responsibility for your actions," Earl translated calmly. "That attitude is exactly why you need close supervision and remedial training. Report to the warehouse Monday night at 10 p.m. sharp. Wear clothes you don't mind getting dirty, because you're going to learn what real work looks like." Brad, who had been calculating his options while the others spoke, finally reached his conclusion. "What guarantee do I have that accepting your terms will actually resolve this? How do I know you won't file complaints anyway after we do what you want?" Earl's answer demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that had made him successful in military logistics. "Because my objective isn't punishment, it's behavior modification. I want this workplace to be professional and respectful, not to destroy people's careers. But my offer has an expiration date, and it's contingent on complete compliance with the terms. Earl checked his watch with theatrical precision. You have 5 minutes to decide. Accept my terms, begin implementation immediately, and this matter stays between us and the witnesses present. Reject my terms or fail to comply fully, and everything goes official through corporate and legal channels. The countdown created additional pressure that pushed Brad toward accepting terms that were generous compared to the alternatives. But Earl wasn't finished applying leverage. One more thing, Earl added casually. The security cameras have been recording this entire conversation. Your responses, your attitude, your level of cooperation, all of it is now part of the permanent record. If you agree to my terms but then fail to follow through, that footage becomes evidence of breach of agreement rather than just harassment documentation. Brad's shoulders sagged as he realized that every possible escape route had been systematically blocked. Earl had maneuvered him into a position where cooperation was the only rational choice, and further resistance would only make his eventual consequences more severe. I accept your terms, Brad said quietly. Transfer to day shift, harassment training, written apologies. When do you want this to start? Earl's smile was magnanimous in victory. Excellent decision. You can submit your transfer request first thing Monday morning. In the meantime, you'll complete the remainder of tonight's shift under my direct observation, learning how to interact with coworkers respectfully. The transformation of workplace authority was complete, but Earl's demonstration of power was just beginning. The transformation of MegaMart's overnight culture began immediately, even before Brad submitted his transfer request or Tommy reported for his first warehouse shift. Word of the confrontation spread through the store's informal communication networks with the speed and accuracy that only workplace gossip could achieve. But the details were surprisingly consistent across different versions of the story. Earl had faced down 3 bullies simultaneously, demonstrated physical capabilities that defied every assumption about aging warehouse workers, and systematically dismantled a harassment campaign through superior strategic planning and documentation. More importantly, he'd done it all without resorting to the kind of aggressive behavior that characterized the people he'd been opposing. David arrived for his next scheduled shift to find the atmosphere fundamentally altered in ways both subtle and obvious. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms, but instead of the hostile silence he'd grown accustomed to, the quiet carried respect and curiosity. Coworkers who had previously avoided him out of fear of becoming secondary targets now approached with questions, comments, and the kind of casual interaction that had been missing from his work experience for months. Heard you're some kind of army engineer, Mike the maintenance worker said during their first real conversation in 3 months. My brother-in-law was Navy Seabees. Says you construction guys had the hardest job over there, building stuff while people were shooting at you. The acknowledgement of his military service without mockery or skepticism felt foreign after months of having every aspect of his background questioned and dismissed. David found himself sharing details about combat engineering that he'd kept private since starting at MegaMart, describing the complexity of logistics and construction in hostile environments to someone who actually wanted to understand rather than find reasons to criticize. Janet from customer service made a point of stopping by David's work area during his break, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of nervous smile that preceded difficult conversations. I owe you an apology, she said without preamble. I saw what they were doing to you, and I should have said something. I should have backed you up. David accepted the coffee and gestured for Janet to sit down on one of the equipment crates. You were protecting yourself. I understand that. These situations are complicated, and everyone has to make their own decisions about how much risk they can afford. Janet's relief at his understanding was obvious, but she pressed on with her confession. It wasn't just about protecting myself. I convinced myself that you could handle it, that you were strong enough to take whatever they dished out. I used your strength as an excuse for my cowardice." The conversation revealed something David hadn't fully understood about his own situation. Other employees had recognized his capabilities all along, but instead of offering support, they'd used his perceived strength to justify their own inaction. The assumption that he could handle it had become permission for everyone else to avoid getting involved. Earl's intervention had changed that dynamic by demonstrating that strength without support was still isolation, and that even capable people deserved backup when facing systematic harassment. His strategic documentation and public confrontation had shown everyone that there were effective ways to oppose workplace abuse without becoming victims themselves. The first test of the new order came on Monday night, when Tommy reported to the warehouse for his remedial work assignment. Earl had prepared a comprehensive orientation that began with basic safety training and progressed through increasingly complex tasks that required both physical capability and attention to detail. Tommy's typical approach to work had been to do the minimum necessary to avoid criticism while spending maximum time socializing and positioning himself within the store's political hierarchy. Earl's warehouse demanded different priorities: efficiency over politics, competence over connections, and results over relationships. "Freight handling isn't about muscle," Earl explained as he demonstrated proper lifting techniques to Tommy, who was struggling with tasks that Earl made look effortless. "It's about leverage, timing, and understanding how weight distribution affects stability. Brute force just leads to injuries and damaged merchandise." The lesson extended beyond physical technique to workplace philosophy. Earl was systematically teaching Tommy that real strength came from knowledge and skill rather than intimidation and aggression, that leadership required competence rather than just authority, and that respect had to be earned through consistent performance rather than demanded through fear. David witnessed several of these training sessions during his regular interactions with the warehouse, and he was impressed by Earl's patient but demanding teaching style. The older man had clearly dealt with difficult subordinates during his military career and knew how to channel aggressive energy into productive work without breaking someone's spirit or confidence. More surprisingly, Tommy was responding to the structure and clear expectations in ways that suggested genuine potential for improvement. Separated from Brad's influence and Rex's enabling, he was beginning to demonstrate work ethic and problem-solving, abilities that had been completely hidden during his time as a harassment enforcer. "Kid's got decent instincts when he's not trying to impress the wrong people," Earl confided to David during one of their break room conversations. "Military would have been good for him if he'd enlisted instead of following that fool Brad around for 3 years. Brad's absence from the night shift had created a leadership vacuum that revealed how much of the overnight operation had been organized around avoiding his interference rather than accomplishing actual work. Carlos Ruiz, the former Marine who managed the overnight crew, began spending more time on the floor and quickly recognized improvements in productivity and morale that had begun almost immediately after Brad's transfer. "Don't know what happened between you guys and Hutchinson," Carlos told David during a private conversation in his office, "but whatever it was seems to have fixed some problems I didn't even know we had. Efficiency reports are up 15% this week, and I haven't had a single employee complaint or interpersonal conflict since he moved to days." David's own confidence was growing with each shift that passed without harassment or deliberate sabotage of his work. The mental energy he'd been spending on hypervigilance and defensive positioning could now be redirected toward the job itself, and he was rediscovering the satisfaction that came from competent performance of meaningful work. More importantly, David was beginning to recognize opportunities to use his capabilities in positive ways rather than just hiding them to avoid unwanted attention. When a new employee struggled with organizing a complex inventory section, David offered advice. based on his military logistics experience. When equipment malfunctioned, he applied troubleshooting skills that had kept construction projects operational in far more challenging environments. The most significant change was David's relationship with his fellow employees, who were now seeing him as a resource and colleague rather than a victim to be avoided or pitied. His military background became an asset that provided credibility and expertise rather than a target for mockery and resentment. Earl had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond the immediate resolution of David's harassment situation. By demonstrating that workplace bullying could be effectively opposed through strategic thinking and coordinated action, he had empowered other employees to address problems they'd been accepting as inevitable. From his position at the dock's elevated platform, Earl could see most of the store's back areas, the break room where employees gathered before their shifts, the time clock where punctuality was monitored and discussed, and the supervisor's office where Brad Hutchinson held court with his inner circle of followers. The warehouse's industrial lighting cast long shadows that made observation easy while keeping Earl himself nearly invisible to the drama unfolding in the retail areas. Tonight, Earl watched David arrive precisely at 10:50, 10 minutes before his official start time, but early enough to collect his assignment sheets and prepare for the evening's work. David's movements had the mechanical precision of someone going through practiced motions, but Earl's trained eye caught the subtle signs of stress and exhaustion that were accumulating like compound interest. The slight tremor in David's hands as he punched his time card, the way his shoulders stayed permanently hunched as if expecting an attack, the careful scanning of his surroundings that suggested hypervigilance born from weeks of harassment. Brad's arrival 15 minutes later was announced by the sound of his voice carrying across the warehouse as he joked with Tommy and Rex about something that had happened during their previous shift. The three men moved with the casual confidence of predators in familiar territory, their body language suggesting they owned the space and everyone in it. Earl had seen this dynamic countless times in military settings, small unit leaders who confused authority with dominance and used their positions to feed personal inadequacies rather than accomplish mission objectives. The contrast between David's careful restraint and Brad's casual aggression reminded Earl of some of the worst leadership failures he'd witnessed during his 22 years of service. The military produced its share of petty tyrants, NCOs who used their rank to settle personal scores or compensate for their own insecurities. But military structures provided mechanisms for addressing such problems: clear chains of command, inspector general complaints, and the ultimate accountability that came from life-and-death consequences for leadership failures. Corporate retail environments offered no such protections. Brad's behavior was technically within policy boundaries, making formal complaints difficult to substantiate. The overnight shift's isolation meant fewer witnesses to document inappropriate conduct. Most importantly, the economic vulnerability of employees like David made them reluctant to challenge supervisors who controlled their schedules, performance reviews, and future employment prospects. Earl positioned himself to monitor the evening's first interaction between David and Brad's crew, which occurred at the automotive section where David had been assigned to complete the reorganization that Brad had ordered the previous week. From his observation point near the loading dock, Earl could see the entire aisle and hear most of the conversation through the warehouse's acoustics. Well, Brad's voice carried clearly across the space. If it isn't our favorite weekend. Warrior. Tell me, Castellanos, did you get that motor oil sorted like I asked, or are you going to make excuses about your war wounds again? Earl watched David's posture stiffen almost imperceptibly, a reaction that would have been invisible to casual observers, but was clearly readable to someone with Earl's experience in reading body language under stress. David's response was quiet and professional, but Earl could see the effort it required to maintain that composure. The section's been reorganized according to your specifications. Brad, viscosity sorting is complete, and I've updated the inventory counts to reflect the New arrangement. That's coach to you, soldier boy, Brad corrected, his tone carrying the kind of casual contempt that Earl recognized as a deliberate provocation. And I'll be the judge of whether your work meets specifications. Tommy Rex, why don't you two help me inspect this section? I want to make sure our disabled veteran here hasn't cut any corners. The deliberate mispronunciation of disabled hit Earl like a physical blow, bringing back memories of his own transition from military to civilian employment and the subtle discrimination that veterans faced in workplaces that claimed to support them while systematically undermining their confidence and capabilities. He watched David's hands clench briefly before forcing themselves to relax, a self-control mechanism that Earl had used himself in similar situations. What followed was a masterclass in workplace harassment, disguised as legitimate supervision. Brad and his followers spent 20 minutes finding fault with an organization that was clearly superior to company standards, criticizing David's work pace despite obvious efficiency, and making comments about special treatment for veterans that were technically neutral but obviously designed to humiliate and isolate. Earl documented the interaction in his mental catalog of observations, noting the escalation pattern that had been developing over recent weeks. Military logistics had taught him to track trends and anticipate supply chain disruptions before they became critical problems. The same analytical skills applied to human dynamics. Brad's harassment was following a predictable escalation curve that would eventually reach a breaking point, unless something changed the trajectory. From his position in the warehouse, Earl could also observe other employees' reactions to the ongoing harassment. Janet from customer service had developed a pattern of finding urgent paperwork whenever Brad began targeting David, her discomfort obvious but her unwillingness to intervene equally clear. Mike, the maintenance guy, would discover pressing cleaning tasks in distant parts of the store, physically removing himself from situations where he might be expected to speak up. Even the security guards seemed to develop selective blindness. When Brad's harassment became particularly egregious, this willful ignorance was both understandable and troubling. Earl recognized the survival instinct that kept people from challenging workplace bullies, especially when those bullies had institutional support and the ability to retaliate against anyone who interfered. But he also understood that such passive enabling allowed harassment to escalate unchecked, creating environments where abuse became normalized and victims were systematically isolated. The military had taught Earl that leadership failures at any level of command created cascading effects throughout the entire organization. Brad's abuse of his supervisory position wasn't just harming David. It was poisoning the entire workplace culture and teaching everyone else that competence and dignity were less important than political positioning and personal loyalty to whoever held power. Earl's analysis of the situation was complicated by his own position within the store's hierarchy. As a receiving dock worker, he had minimal interaction with floor staff and no authority to intervene in disputes between supervisors and their subordinates. His age and apparent physical limitations made him an unlikely candidate for confronting younger, more aggressive employees. Most importantly, his own employment was contingent on maintaining the same low profile that had allowed him to observe the harassment without becoming a target himself. But Earl's military experience had also taught him that tactical patience was different from strategic inaction. The most effective interventions often required careful timing, thorough preparation, and the ability to recognize when situations had developed to the point where action became necessary regardless of personal cost. He'd been monitoring the Brad situation for weeks, gathering intelligence and assessing options while waiting for the right moment to make his move. The moment was approaching faster than Earl had anticipated. David's stress responses were becoming more pronounced, suggesting that his psychological resources were nearing exhaustion. Brad's confidence was growing with each successful humiliation, pushing him toward increasingly risky behavior that would eventually cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Most concerning to Earl was the way other employees were beginning to treat David differently, as if the harassment was somehow justified or deserved. Earl had seen this pattern before in military units where toxic leadership had been allowed to persist unchecked. Eventually, the institutional tolerance for abuse would reach a tipping point where victims would either break completely or respond with the kind of desperate action that created casualties on all sides. The signs were all present: escalating harassment, institutional indifference, victim isolation, and a perpetrator whose success was feeding increasingly dangerous overconfidence. As the evening wore on, Earl continued his surveillance while processing the night's deliveries with mechanical efficiency. His hands sorted merchandise and updated inventory records, while his mind calculated probabilities and contingencies, preparing for the intervention that was becoming inevitable. The question wasn't whether he would need to act, but when and how to do so in a way that would resolve the situation without creating new problems for everyone involved. The moment served as both vindication for David's months of patient endurance and validation of Earl's strategic intervention in the workplace harassment that had nearly broken him. The same physical capabilities that Brad Hutchinson had mocked as inadequate were now being celebrated as remarkable, and the military background that had been dismissed as irrelevant was being recognized as invaluable. Rex approached David after the equipment had been positioned and the crowd had dispersed, his expression carrying the kind of respect that only came from witnessing something genuinely impressive. "Man, if we'd known you could do stuff like that, everything would have been different. I mean, we were such idiots, calling you weak when you're obviously stronger than all of us combined." David's response reflected the wisdom he'd gained through months of harassment, followed by Earl's mentorship in strategic thinking and professional dignity. Strength isn't about proving yourself to people who don't respect you. It's about using your capabilities to help accomplish things that matter. Tonight mattered because it helped the team solve a real problem. As David completed his final shifts at MegaMart, he reflected on how Earl's intervention had changed far more than just his immediate work environment. The older veteran had demonstrated that dignity and strength could coexist with humility and service, that true authority came from competence rather than intimidation, and that the most effective way to stop bullying was through strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction. The job interview with Titan Construction went exactly as David had hoped. His military background, combined with his demonstrated ability to overcome adversity and maintain professional standards under difficult circumstances, made him exactly the kind of employee they were seeking. The salary represented more than financial security. It was recognition that his capabilities had value in the civilian world. On his last night at MegaMart, Earl presented David with a simple gift: a new deadlifting belt with 300 Club embroidered on the leather, along with a handwritten note that read, "Some battles are won through patient endurance, others through decisive action. The strongest warriors know the difference." Earl Washington. David's transformation from harassed victim to respected professional had taken less than 6 months, but the lessons learned would influence every decision he made for the rest of his career. He'd discovered that hiding his capabilities to avoid conflict was a form of self-imposed limitation, that standing up for others often required standing up for himself first, and that true strength was measured by the positive impact you had on the people around you rather than the weight you could lift or the abuse you could endure. The man who walked out of MegaMart for the last time bore little resemblance to the defeated veteran who had started there months earlier. David Castellanos was finally ready to build the civilian career that his military service had prepared him for, armed with the knowledge that strength without wisdom was just violence, but wisdom backed by genuine capability could change everything. 2 years later, David stood in a hard hat and safety vest, overseeing the construction of a bridge that would connect 2 rural communities for the first time in decades. As project coordinator for Titan Construction, he discovered that his military engineering skills translated perfectly to civilian infrastructure development. and his ability to manage complex logistics under pressure had earned him rapid promotions and industry recognition. His phone buzzed with a text from Earl. "Saw the news article about your bridge project. Proud of you, specialist. Still teaching warehouse wisdom to the next generation of knuckleheads." David smiled, remembering how Earl's intervention had saved not just his job, but his entire sense of self-worth. The older veteran had retired from MegaMart the previous year, but remained active as a mentor for transitioning veterans, using the same strategic wisdom that had transformed their workplace to help others find their footing in civilian careers. Brad had lasted 6 months on day shift before quitting retail entirely, reportedly finding work in his brother's insurance office where his interpersonal skills were less relevant to success. Tommy had surprised everyone by requesting a permanent transfer to warehouse operations, where Earl's mentorship had revealed genuine potential for logistics management. Rex had used his harassment training experience to become an advocate for workplace respect, eventually earning promotion to assistant manager. But the most remarkable transformation belonged to David himself. The scrawny veteran who had once hidden his 300-pound deadlift now lifted heavy machinery with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was worth. If this story of hidden strength and workplace justice inspired you, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Share your own experiences with workplace bullying in the comments below. Your story might help someone else find their strength. Like this video if you believe everyone deserves respect at work, and check out our other incredible true stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Remember, you never know what someone is truly capable of until they're pushed to reveal it. The warehouse's cameras captured Earl's methodical work routine, but they couldn't record the strategic planning that was taking place behind his weathered features, or the way his seemingly routine tasks were positioning him for the confrontation that was coming sooner than anyone realized. The breaking point came on a Friday night in late November, when the store was running behind schedule due to a delayed shipment of Black Friday merchandise that had arrived 6 hours late. Corporations had been calling every hour demanding updates on the inventory processing, and the pressure was filtering down through the management chain in the form of unrealistic deadlines and increasingly aggressive supervision. David had been assigned to work a double shift, staying over from his regular 11 to 7 schedule to help with the emergency inventory processing. By 11 p.m., he'd already been working for 12 hours straight, his chronic back pain flaring from the extended physical demands and his prescription medication wearing off at the worst possible time. The delayed shipment contained electronics and seasonal items that required careful handling and precise placement, but the accelerated schedule meant there was no time for the methodical approach that David preferred. Brad arrived for his shift in an unusually foul mood, having been chewed out by the district manager about the processing delays and threatened with performance reviews that could affect his upcoming evaluation. His solution to the corporate pressure was to double down on his harassment of David, treating the overtime situation as an opportunity to demonstrate his authority in front of a larger audience than usual. "Look who's still here," Brad announced, as he spotted David restocking electronics near the customer service area. "Our part-time hero decides to work some real hours for once. What's the matter, Castellanos? Your disability checks are not covering the bills this month?" David's exhaustion made it harder to maintain his usual diplomatic responses. "Just helping with the inventory backlog, Brad. We're all trying to get caught up before the weekend." "We're all trying," Brad repeated mockingly. Listen to this guy, talking like he's part of some team effort. You think working one double shift makes you special? Some of us have been pulling extra hours for weeks without complaining about our war wounds. Tommy and Rex, energized by their supervisor's aggressive mood, moved closer to form their familiar intimidation triangle around David. The customer service area's open layout meant their interaction was visible to several other employees, including Janet, who looked up nervously from her paperwork but made no move to intervene. "Hey, Coach," Tommy said, grinning at what he clearly thought was a brilliant observation. "You think our boy here is claiming overtime for his therapy sessions? I heard disabled vets get all kinds of special benefits for their PTSD counseling and stuff." The comment about PTSD hit David like a physical blow, touching on aspects of his military service that he'd never discussed with anyone at MegaMart. His sleep problems and hypervigilance weren't just about chronic pain. They were about memories that had nothing to do with his injury and everything to do with experiences that these three would never understand or respect. "I don't have PTSD," David said quietly, his voice tight with the effort of maintaining control. "Sure you don't," Rex added, emboldened by the group dynamic. "That's why you jump every time someone drops something, right? That's why you look around like you're expecting someone to start shooting. Face it, dude, you're damaged goods." Brad's eyes lit up with predatory interest at David's obvious discomfort. "You know what I think? I think our friend here is milking his military service for everything it's worth. Fake disability, fake trauma, fake hero status. Meanwhile, those of us who stayed home and did honest work have to pick up the slack." The accusation of faking his service-related injuries was the most direct assault on David's character that Brad had attempted, crossing from workplace harassment into territory that felt dangerously personal. David's military medical records were legitimate, his injuries were real, and his service had been honorable despite the circumstances that ended it. But explaining that would require sharing details about his deployment that he'd kept private for reasons that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with protecting the memory of soldiers who hadn't made it home. "My service record speaks for itself," David said, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "Does it?" Brad pressed, clearly sensing he'd found a nerve worth targeting. "Because from where I'm standing, all I see is someone who couldn't hack it in the real military and now can't hack it in the real world either. Tell me, what exactly did you accomplish over there that was so important? What did you build that couldn't have been built by any construction worker with half a brain?" The question revealed Brad's complete ignorance about combat engineering and the complexity of military logistics, but it also demonstrated his willingness to attack David's service record directly. David had built bridges under enemy fire, cleared roads through terrain that killed vehicles and personnel, and maintained supply lines that kept entire units operational in hostile territory. But explaining those accomplishments would sound like bragging, and David's military training had emphasized humility and teamwork over individual recognition. The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of Earl's equipment cart approaching the customer service area. The older man had emerged from the warehouse pushing the loaded dolly, apparently oblivious to the tension that had been building among the younger employees. His timing seemed coincidental, but David noticed that Earl's route brought him directly through the middle of their conversation. "Evening, gentlemen," Earl said in his quiet voice, maneuvering his cart around the group. "David, I've got those electronics you requested from the morning shipment. Where would you like me to set them?" Brad's attention immediately shifted to Earl, who represented an even easier target than David in terms of apparent vulnerability and lack of institutional protection. At 62, with his slight build and deferential manner, Earl looked like someone who could be pushed around without consequences. More importantly, harassing the warehouse worker would demonstrate Brad's authority while providing entertainment. For Tommy and Rex. "Well, well," Brad said, his voice taking on the same mocking tone he'd been using with David. "If it isn't Grandpa Earl, shuffling around with his little cart. Tell me, old man, do you need help lifting those boxes? Wouldn't want you to throw out your back like our friend here." Earl's expression remained neutral as he continued unloading his cart, but David noticed a subtle change in the way the older man positioned himself, shifting his weight in a way that suggested awareness of the developing situation. "I'm managing." "Fine, thank you," Earl said calmly. "Just trying to get caught up on the inventory processing like everyone else." "Like everyone else," Brad repeated, clearly enjoying himself. "You hear that? Grandpa thinks he's pulling his weight around here. At your age, shouldn't you be collecting Social Security instead of taking jobs away from people who actually need them?" Tommy laughed appreciatively at what he considered a particularly clever insult. "Yeah, seriously, how old are you? Like 70? Shouldn't you be in a retirement home somewhere?" Earl continued his work without responding, but David could see the tension building in the older man's movements. There was something about Earl's body language that reminded David of his own combat training, a controlled readiness that suggested capabilities hidden beneath the surface. "I asked you a question, old man," Brad said, stepping closer to Earl's cart. "It's rude to ignore your supervisors. Maybe your hearing is going along with everything else." Rex, always eager to prove himself to the group, reached out and deliberately knocked several items from Earl's cart, sending electronic components scattering across the floor. "Oops," he said with exaggerated innocence. "Guess your hands aren't as steady as they used to be." The sound of expensive merchandise hitting the concrete floor carried across the store, and David saw Janet look up in alarm from her desk. Other employees who had been trying to ignore the situation suddenly found themselves witnessing what was clearly escalating beyond normal workplace harassment. They called him Scrawny until he lifted 300 pounds and crushed their ego in front of everyone who had ever doubted him. David Castellanos pushed the shopping cart across the polished concrete floor of MegaMart, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows under his tired eyes. At 28, his slight frame of 5'7" and barely 140 pounds made him nearly invisible among the towering shelves of America's largest retail chain. The navy blue vest hung loose on his narrow shoulders, the name tag reading, "David, happy to help," seemed almost mocking given how most customers treated him. 3 months into his job as an overnight stocker, David had perfected the art of moving through the store like a ghost. His work boots, worn thin from years of use, made barely a whisper against the floor as he methodically restocked shelves with the efficiency that came from military precision. The thick-rimmed glasses perched on his angular face constantly slipped down his nose as he worked, a nervous habit left over from his days wearing heavy combat gear in desert heat. David had deliberately chosen the overnight shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., partly because it paid 50 cents more per hour, but mostly because it meant fewer people around to witness his current situation. Being a veteran working retail was hard, enough without having to explain to every well-meaning customer why someone who'd served his country was now arranging cereal boxes at 2 in the morning. The transition from Staff Sergeant David Castellanos, Army Corps of Engineers, to David the overnight stocker hadn't been in any of his plans. 2 years ago, he'd been leading a squad of 12 soldiers, building bridges and clearing obstacles in Afghanistan. He'd been responsible for million-dollar equipment, life-and-death decisions, and the safety of his entire unit. Now his biggest responsibility was making sure the Cheerios were facing forward and the price tags were straight. The injury that ended his military career hadn't been dramatic or heroic. No roadside bomb or enemy fire, just a construction accident during a routine base improvement project. A steel beam had shifted unexpectedly, catching his left leg and crushing 3 vertebrae in his lower back. The doctors said he was lucky to walk at all, let alone without a permanent limp. What they couldn't fix was the nerve damage that left him with chronic pain and unpredictable muscle spasms. The VA disability payments helped, but they weren't enough to cover rent, food, and the physical therapy he couldn't afford to skip. David had applied for dozens of jobs that matched his engineering background and leadership experience, but every interview ended the same way. Potential employers would seem interested until the topic of his medical discharge came up, then suddenly, there would be budget constraints, or they'd need to review other candidates. MegaMart had been different. The overnight manager, Carlos Ruiz, was a former Marine who'd hired David on the spot after a 5-minute conversation. You show up, you work hard, you don't cause problems, and you've got a job here as long as you want it, Carlos had said, shaking David's hand with the firm grip of one veteran to another. The work was mindless but honest. David would arrive at 11, receive his list of aisles and tasks, then disappear into the maze of merchandise until dawn. He restocked shelves, built displays, and occasionally helped with inventory. The physical demands were manageable most nights, though his back would ache by morning, and some days the pain medication made everything feel like he was moving through thick fog. David had developed a routine that minimized interaction with the handful of other overnight employees. There was Janet, the 60-something woman who worked the customer service desk and spent most of her shift reading romance novels. There was Mike, the maintenance guy who kept the store clean and rarely spoke to anyone except to complain about whatever mess the day shift had left for him. And then there were the 3 overnight supervisors who rotated shifts and made David's life complicated in different ways. The worst of them was Brad Hutchinson, though he insisted everyone call him Coach. At 35, Brad was built like the high school football player he'd once been, with broad shoulders, a thick neck, and the kind of confidence that came from having peaked at 17 and never quite realized it. He'd been working at MegaMart for 8 years, climbing from stock boy to overnight supervisor, and he treated the position like he was commanding an army instead of overseeing a handful of retail workers. Brad's management style seemed to revolve around finding fault with everything David did. If David finished his assigned aisles too quickly, he was rushing through the work and probably missing things. If he took the full allotted time, he was slow and inefficient. If David suggested a better way to organize a display based on his logistics experience, Brad would dismiss it as overthinking and make him do it the hard way. The other supervisors, Kevin Martinez and Ashley Chun, were tolerable. Kevin was a community college student who mostly left David alone as long as the work got done. Ashley was actually helpful, often warning David when corporate visits or spot inspections were scheduled. But Brad seemed to take personal pleasure in making David's job harder than it needed to be. Tonight was a typical Tuesday, which meant Brad was in charge and looking for reasons to assert his authority. David had been assigned to restock the entire health and beauty section, a task that typically took most of the shift due to the sheer number of small items and the need to check expiration dates on everything from vitamins to shampoo. David methodically worked through his list, checking each item against the inventory system on his handheld scanner. The repetitive nature of the work allowed his mind to wander, something that had become both a blessing and a curse since leaving the military. In Afghanistan, his mind had been sharp and focused, constantly assessing threats and planning contingencies. Now, with nothing but toothpaste tubes and deodorant sticks to occupy his attention, his thoughts often drifted to darker places. He thought about his former squad members, most of whom had successfully transitioned to civilian careers in construction or engineering. He thought about the bridge projects he'd never finish, the leadership positions he'd never hold again, and the simple respect he'd once commanded just by wearing the uniform. Most painfully, he thought about his ex-fiancée Sarah, who'd tried to stay supportive through his medical discharge and rehabilitation, but eventually admitted she needed to be with someone who had their life together. The physical therapy sessions had helped with more than just his back injury. Dr. Patricia Reeves, his therapist, had been a competitive powerlifter before earning her degree in physical therapy. She'd explained that while his lower back needed careful management, building strength in his upper body and core could help compensate for the damaged areas. Under her guidance, David had discovered something remarkable. Despite his slight appearance, he had an extraordinary capacity for gaining functional strength. The work was slow and careful, focusing on compound movements and progressive overload, rather than aesthetics. David's frame would never look like a bodybuilder's, but the weights he could move steadily increased month after month. What started as rehabilitation became something approaching obsession, a way to reclaim some sense of control and capability in his new reality. 3 mornings a week after finishing his shift at MegaMart, David would drive to Iron Temple, a bare-bones gym in an industrial area of town. The owner, Rico Santos, was another veteran who understood that some people lifted weights for reasons that had nothing to do with looking good in a mirror. The gym was filled with serious lifters, construction workers, and first responders who trained before or after long shifts out at Iron Temple. David could deadlift, squat, and bench press weights that would shock anyone who saw his ordinary appearance. His best deadlift of 315 pounds was respectable for anyone, remarkable for someone his size, and absolutely unbelievable to anyone who only knew him as the quiet guy who stocked shelves at MegaMart. But David kept this part of his life completely separate from work. He'd learned early in his retail career that showing any kind of strength or capability only made his situation worse. Managers would assign him the heaviest lifting tasks. Co-workers would expect him to handle their difficult customers, and everyone would wonder why someone who was clearly capable of more was just working retail. So he remained invisible, arriving each night with his shoulders slightly hunched, his voice soft when he spoke to anyone, and his true capabilities hidden beneath the unflattering uniform and tired demeanor of someone just trying to make it through another shift. The cramped studio apartment felt smaller each day, its beige walls and worn carpet a constant reminder of how far his life had fallen from the disciplined purpose of his military career. The only decoration was a single framed photograph on the cheap particle board dresser, his old squad from Afghanistan, 12 soldiers in full gear, smiling despite the harsh conditions and constant danger. David avoided looking at it most mornings, but today his eyes lingered on the faces of men who'd trusted him with their lives and never doubted his capability to keep them safe. Staff Sergeant David Castellanos would have handled Brad Hutchinson very differently than retail employee David was handling him now. Military David had commanded respect through competence and quiet authority, had made decisions that affected the safety of his entire unit, had built infrastructure under enemy fire while maintaining the morale and effectiveness of soldiers who looked to him for leadership. That version of himself felt like a ghost now, haunting the edges of his consciousness and whispering about the man he used to be. The shower water ran cold by the time David forced himself to move, another reminder of the corner cutting that defined his current existence. As he stood under the inadequate spray, he mentally cataloged the ways he could have ended Brad's harassment in his previous life. A sharp word delivered with the right tone and backed by genuine authority. A conversation with Brad's superior that would have resulted in immediate corrective action. Most simply, the kind of physical presence that made it clear challenging him would be a serious mistake. But those options belonged to Staff Sergeant Castellanos, not to David the overnight stalker who couldn't afford to lose his health insurance or face the months of unemployment that would follow any workplace confrontation. The military had taught him to assess threats and respond proportionally, but civilian life operated by different rules that left him feeling helpless in situations where his training should have provided clear solutions. After a breakfast of instant oatmeal and black coffee, David drove to Iron Temple, the one place where the different versions of himself could coexist without contradiction. Rico Santos unlocked the door at 11 a.m. sharp, greeting David with the kind of nod that passed for conversation among serious lifters. The gym's industrial atmosphere, with its concrete floors and minimal amenities, felt more like home than his apartment ever did. David's training routine had evolved far beyond the rehabilitation exercises his physical therapist had originally prescribed. 3 days a week, he followed a powerlifting program that pushed his body's limits while respecting the constraints imposed by his injury. The other 3 days focused on functional movements and conditioning work that maintained the physical readiness his military training had ingrained as non-negotiable. Today was deadlift day, and David approached the barbell with the ritual precision that had characterized his entire adult life. 225 pounds loaded onto the Olympic bar, enough weight to challenge most recreational lifters, but well within David's current capabilities. The gym's mirrors reflected back the same slight frame that made him invisible at MegaMart, but the weight came off the floor with an ease that would have shocked his co-workers. As he added plates for his working sets, David's mind wandered to the calculations that governed his current existence. At 143 pounds, he was deadlifting more than twice his body weight, a ratio that placed him in advanced territory by any objective standard. His bench press of 210 pounds would have been respectable for athletes significantly larger than himself. His squat, limited by his back injury but still progressing steadily, demonstrated the kind of functional strength that came from treating training as a necessity rather than a hobby. But these numbers existed in complete isolation from his daily reality. Brad Hutchinson outweighed David by at least 60 pounds and probably assumed that size differential translated directly into dominance in any physical confrontation. Tommy and Rex, though younger and less experienced, were both bigger and clearly more willing to escalate situations beyond the verbal harassment that currently defined their interactions. The irony wasn't lost on David that he possessed exactly the physical capabilities necessary to end his workplace problems, but using those capabilities would create far larger problems than they solved. Corporate America had zero tolerance for workplace violence, regardless of provocation or self-defense considerations. Video surveillance would capture any physical altercation without the context that might justify his actions. Brad's connections within the company hierarchy would ensure that any official investigation concluded with David's termination and possible criminal charges. More fundamentally, David's military training had emphasized the principle that physical force was a last resort, to be used only when all other options had been exhausted and the stakes justified the risks. His drill sergeants had been clear that the strongest soldiers were those who could maintain discipline under pressure, who could absorb abuse without breaking, who could prioritize mission success over personal satisfaction. But that philosophy was predicated on serving a larger purpose, on sacrificing personal comfort for objectives that mattered beyond individual pride. What purpose was being served by enduring Brad's harassment? What mission was accomplished by allowing himself to be systematically humiliated in front of co-workers who were learning that veterans could be pushed around with impunity? David completed his deadlift session with mechanical precision, working up to 295 pounds for a single repetition that moved smoothly despite the weight that would have challenged lifters twice his size. The physical exertion provided temporary relief from the mental pressure that had been building for weeks, but he knew the respite was temporary. In 8 hours, he'd be back at MegaMart, back to playing the role of victim in Brad's power games. The drive home took him past Riverside High School, where Brad's glory days were memorialized in faded photographs and forgotten trophy cases. David found himself wondering what might have happened if their paths had crossed 20 years ago. When Brad was at his physical peak and David was still just a skinny kid from a working-class family, the outcome would probably have been the same, but for different reasons. David wouldn't have known how to fight back then, while now he knew exactly how but couldn't afford the consequences. Back in his apartment, David tried to nap before his evening shift, but found sleep impossible. His mind kept cycling through scenarios where he'd finally reached his breaking point, where Brad's harassment had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored, where the careful calculations of risk and reward had shifted enough to justify action. In these fantasies, David moved with the same precision he brought to his deadlifts, applying exactly the right amount of force to end the situation without creating new problems. But fantasies were dangerous luxuries that his current reality couldn't accommodate. David forced himself to review his budget instead, calculating the exact number of paychecks he needed to reach financial stability, the precise timeline for paying off his medical debts, the specific goals that made his current suffering worthwhile. Every night shift at MegaMart brought him closer to independence, even if each night also chipped away at his self-respect and mental health. The prescription bottle rattled again, as David prepared for another evening of psychological warfare. The sound a reminder of the physical vulnerabilities that complicated every decision he made. His back injury wasn't just about pain management. It was about the career limitations that had forced him into retail work, the medical expenses that made his MegaMart income essential, and the daily reminder that his body had betrayed him at the moment when his military service should have been transitioning into civilian success. As David laced up his work boots and prepared to face another shift, he caught sight of his reflection in the apartment's single mirror. The man looking back at him bore little resemblance to the confident soldier in the framed photograph, but David knew the capabilities were still there beneath the surface. The question was whether those capabilities would remain dormant forever, or whether Brad Hutchinson was pushing toward a confrontation that would finally reveal who David Castellanos really was beneath the uniform and forced humility of his current circumstances. The evening shift loomed ahead, another 8 hours of careful restraint and swallowed pride, another test of his ability to maintain discipline under conditions that would have broken lesser men years ago. Earl's shift at the receiving dock began at 10 p.m., 90 minutes before the official start of the overnight cruise schedule. This early arrival wasn't required by company policy, but it gave him time to process the day's final deliveries and prepare the warehouse for the night's work without interruption. More importantly, it provided him with a strategic vantage point to observe the dynamics that played out among the floor staff as they transitioned from day-to-night operations. Brad Hutchinson surveyed his domain with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally found his place in the world's hierarchy. The overnight shift at MegaMart might not seem like much to outsiders, but to Brad it represented everything he'd always believed he deserved: authority, respect, and the power to make other people's lives easier or harder based entirely on his whims. At 35, Brad still carried himself like the linebacker he'd been at Riverside High School, where he'd been team captain, homecoming king, and the kind of guy everyone either wanted to be or be with. Those had been the golden years when his size and athleticism opened every door and his confidence was backed by genuine achievement. College had been different, harder, full of guys who were bigger and faster and hungrier than him. After washing out of the football program at State, Brad had drifted through a series of jobs that never quite lived up to his expectations. MegaMart had been meant to be temporary, just something to pay the bills while he figured out his next move. That was 8 years ago. Somewhere along the way, temporary had become permanent, and Brad had decided that if he was going to be stuck in retail, he was going to make sure everyone knew who was in charge. The overnight supervisor position came with real power within the store's ecosystem. Brad controlled schedules, assignments, performance reviews, and most importantly, who got recommended for promotions or transfers to better shifts. He could make someone's work life pleasant and easy, or he could turn every night into 8 hours of misery. The choice was entirely his, and Brad had developed a clear system for deciding which employees deserved which treatment. His favorites were the younger guys, who reminded him of his old teammates, workers who showed proper respect for his authority and laughed at his jokes about the old days. These employees got the easy assignments, the best schedules, and advance warning about surprise inspections from corporations. They formed Brad's unofficial inner circle, always ready to back him up and amplify his authority. The two most loyal members of this circle were Tommy Briggs and Rex Sullivan, both in their early 20s and clearly impressed by Brad's stories of high school glory. Tommy was stocky and aggressive, with the kind of quick temper that made him useful for intimidating other employees who might be thinking about complaining to upper management. Rex was taller and leaner, more calculating than Tommy, but equally committed to maintaining the social order that kept them in Brad's good graces. Together, the three of them had created an unofficial hierarchy that extended far beyond what was outlined in the employee handbook. They controlled access to the break room during busy periods, decided who got to use the single functioning radio for background music, and determined which employees were team players worthy of inclusion in their conversations. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the workers Brad considered beneath contempt, the older employees who were clearly failures in life, the college students who thought they were too good for retail work, and worst of all, people like David Castellanos, who had somehow convinced themselves they deserved respect despite their obvious inadequacies. David particularly irritated Brad because he didn't fit into any of the categories that made sense in Brad's worldview. He wasn't a teenager working his first job, wasn't a retiree looking for something to do, and wasn't obviously disabled or incompetent. He was a grown man in what should have been his prime, doing work that any high schooler could handle, and somehow maintaining an air of quiet dignity that Brad found personally offensive. The military service angle made it even worse. Brad had been planning to enlist after college, had even talked to recruiters about officer programs, but life had gotten in the way. Now here was David, an actual veteran, stocking shelves like it was the best he could do. It felt like an insult to everything Brad thought military service was supposed to represent, and it made him question his own decision not to serve. So Brad had made David a special project, a way to prove that all the respect and deference people claimed veterans deserved was just politically correct nonsense. If David was really as tough and capable as his service record suggested, he wouldn't be working retail in the first place. If he couldn't handle the basic challenges of civilian employment, then maybe he wasn't the hero people made him out to be. The beauty of Brad's position was that everything he did could be justified as legitimate management. When he assigned David the most physically demanding tasks, it was because we need our strongest workers on the heavy lifting. When he criticized David's work pace, it was because we have standards to maintain. When he scheduled David for the worst shifts during inventory weeks, it was because everyone needs to do their part. The company's employee handbook was full of policies about respectful workplace behavior and professional conduct, but Brad had learned exactly how to stay within the technical boundaries while making his point clear. He never used, obviously, offensive language or made direct threats. Instead, he relied on tone, context, and the kind of psychological pressure that was impossible to document in a formal complaint. David's military background actually made him an easier target in some ways because veterans were trained to follow orders and respect the chain of command. Brad could phrase his harassment as legitimate work directives, and David's ingrained discipline would compel him to comply even when the requests were unreasonable or unnecessarily difficult. The other overnight employees had learned to stay out of Brad's way when he was focusing on a particular target. Janet from customer service would find reasons to be busy in her booth whenever Brad started harassing David. Mike, the maintenance guy, would suddenly discover urgent cleaning tasks in other parts of the store. Even the security guards would develop selective blindness when Brad's crew decided to make someone's night more difficult. This willful ignorance was partly self-preservation and partly genuine fear. Brad had been known to retaliate against employees who showed too much sympathy for his targets, and everyone needed their jobs too much to risk becoming the next focus of his attention. The overnight shift attracted people who were already dealing with difficult circumstances, and none of them could afford to lose their income over principle. Upper management rarely worked nights, and when they did visit the store after hours, Brad's behavior would transform completely. He became professional, helpful, and respectful to everyone, creating reports that praised his team's productivity and highlighted his own leadership skills. Corporate loved supervisors who could maintain efficiency with minimal drama. And Brad's ability to keep his true nature hidden during official visits had earned him several commendations. The few complaints that had been filed against Brad over the years had been handled by the same day shift managers who only saw his professional facade. Without witnesses willing to risk their jobs by speaking up, and with Brad's excellent performance reviews as evidence, the complaints were typically dismissed as personality conflicts or misunderstandings about workplace expectations. David represented everything Brad despised about the modern world's obsession with participation trophies and unearned respect. Here was someone who'd been given credit for military service, but couldn't even handle the basic challenges of retail work. Someone who walked around with that quiet, dignified bearing that suggested he thought he was better than his circumstances, when clearly his circumstances were exactly what he deserved. Brad had made it his personal mission to strip away that dignity, to prove that underneath the military bearing and respectful demeanor was just another failure who couldn't cut it. In the real world, every night was an opportunity to chip away at David's composure, to find the breaking point that would reveal who he really was. The power dynamic was perfect from Brad's perspective. He held all the cards, controlled all the variables, and faced no real consequences for his actions. David needed the job, couldn't afford to quit, and had nowhere to file complaints that would be taken seriously. It was exactly the kind of situation where Brad could exercise the authority he'd always believed he deserved, proving to himself and everyone else that he was exactly where he belonged in life's natural hierarchy. Tonight would be no different. Except that Brad was feeling particularly motivated to make his point clear. In the farthest corner of MegaMart's sprawling warehouse where the loading docks met the employee parking lot, Earl Washington operated in a world that most of the store's staff never saw or thought about. At 62 years old, Earl was the kind of employee who became invisible through sheer longevity and complete reliability. He'd been working the receiving dock for 11 years, processing shipments, organizing inventory, and maintaining the complex logistics that kept the store's shelves stocked.